All right, I've got an astonishing amount of caffeine coursing through my veins right now. I'm building up to a max meme hang snatch, so just going to be going from the absurdly high hang or trying to make as much of a true hip snatch as possible, and we'll see how heavy we get. And in between those sets, I'm going to be discussing my thoughts on what it truly means to be evidence-based, some of the really valid criticisms of the evidence-based movement, or more, I think everyone has a pretty solid respect for the hierarchy of evidence and like what it means to be evidence-based in relation to that. But then with the emergence of evidence-based influences, I don't know, social media, Marshall McLuhan always says the medium is the message, and trying to be an evidence-based influencer, it's an awkward way to position yourself in my opinion. Anyway, I'm going to start warming up and then hopefully I can get some coherent thoughts out in between sets. So I came in, started lifting weights, started going to gyms, and the tail end of what I would refer to as the bro science era. Everyone was gatekeeping information. We had the emergence of forums like bodybuilding.com forum, and everyone was just reading simply shredded interviews. Basically, the scene was, if you want to know something, you go ask the biggest and strongest guy in your gym. No one else's opinion counts. It was just appeals to authority. There was no PMIDs, no one asking for evidence, no real understanding, or like very little discussion of what the hierarchy of evidence was. Just for anyone who's not explicitly familiar with the hierarchy of evidence, it's something you typically learn about when you go to university, or some people probably start learning about it towards the end of high school. So I think at the top of the hierarchy of evidence, we've got like things like systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and then beneath that, we just have single studies. And obviously there's a few tiers within that. And then below that, we have expert opinion, and then we have pleb opinion. So it's hard to say, what was the catalyst for the emergence of the evidence-based era? I think it was people accepting that it was impossible to separate the opinions and the anecdotes of the biggest and the strongest people in the gym from like genetics and things like that. So how do we really know that they have the best training protocols? Because there's so many other things to factor in. These things need to be studied at a population level. It can't just be like anecdote, appeal to authority, and all these N of 1 references. We need to get larger populations, observe them doing different protocols in as controlled a setting as we can manage. And again, this is the ecological validity of a lot of sports science is something that sort of comes up time and time and time again. And, I think there needs to be some more acknowledgement of that from the evidence-based, from the staunch evidence-based crowd, or the evidence-based identifying crowd. And there needs to be a little bit more respect for how hard it actually is to do ecologically valid research in sports science. We have to have respect for it's hard to get funding. There's not unlimited research dollars, and a lot of the funding for science isn't allocated towards doing better bicep curls. It's allocated towards much bigger and broader public health issues. So then, I guess we entered an age of fitness where people have a lot more respect for the hierarchy of evidence and a lot less respect for just the anecdotes of the biggest and the strongest, or the people getting the craziest results, or the most experienced coaches. And in a certain way, this has removed a lot of the gatekeeping of information because it's relatively publicly accessible. Like a lot of journals, you do need money to access because they're behind paywalls, but if you're crafty, you can get around a lot of those paywalls if you really want the information. So in that sense, I love how I feel like one of the strengths of the evidence-based era, it's promoted accessibility information, not just like gatekeeping of most experienced coaches holding onto all the secrets of training. But I think one of the things that frustrates a lot of the OGs in the industry, or a lot of the old heads, is now you've got a lot of pencil necks or a lot of people with relatively no training experience lecturing all these people who've got better results than they have about how they should be training based on what they've read in the research. And saying that the bros will always say, and the good evidence-based people say, is like, you're not a population average. You are an N of 1 at the end of the day. So you've got to find this sweet spot between having a respect for what works at a population level, but then where the evidence-based era, a lot of the poorer thinking in the evidence-based community isn't having enough respect for that individualized context and how to find your own N of one within that bandwidth of what has been deemed scientifically valid or productive. One of the biggest criticisms of the evidence-based era is that all the studies are on untrained participants. And one of the criticisms that this is also tied to is that the periods of observation for these studies aren't long enough, and that the cohort sizes also aren't large enough. And this is definitely something that leads to a lot of people questioning the ecological validity of a lot of these studies, like especially if you're a relatively advanced trainee. Are any of these studies that have been conducted on a relatively small cohort over a relatively short period of time, how meaningful are they as far as advising our training going forward? And the reality is, despite what a lot of people say, the shit that works when you're a beginner, it's like the same things keep working. Like a lot of the advanced methods when it comes to strength and conditioning, it just hasn't seemed to play out in the research. The things that work for beginners, so why sports science researchers like using beginners in their studies? One, advanced trainees, as much as they whinge about the body of evidence, a lot of them aren't willing to participate in these studies. So the thing about beginners is, credit to them, they're willing to participate in these studies, and because they're so sensitive to all these different training stimuli, you actually get to see a decent effect size in a short period of time. So it does allow us to build out a bigger body of evidence, although slightly less ecologically valid. It's like, what, do you want one study to be done a year? I know we can't just completely water down the quality and have this really large but trash body of evidence, but you need to have more respect for the challenging logistics of producing high quality sports science research on the critics of the evidence-based era side. But then also the people who are staunch evidence-based practitioners, they need to be more open and honest about the realities of the ecological validity of a lot of these studies, which are better than what a lot of the critics say, because like I said, same shit that works on beginners, it's going to keep working the whole way through, largely speaking. And then one of the things that made the evidence-based era taking off extra spicy is it kind of coincided with the social media explosion of the fitness industry as well. It just led to so much more clickbait, so much more hot takes around this topic. So at the start, it was sort of viewed that all the influencers and all the popular people on socials, they weren't evidence-based, they were just the bros. And then it was only just people criticizing them, littering PMIDs in their comment sections, calling out all their videos. But now we've almost entered this second stage of social media fitness and this second era of the evidence-based era where we legitimately have evidence-based influencers. These people like Brett Contreras, these people like Menno, where, and again, going back to that Marshall McLuhan quote, the medium is the message. To use social media effectively, in my opinion, you need to be posting daily. So you need to be able to talk about something new on a daily basis. This doesn't marry up well with the genuine rate of progress in sports science, because there isn't something new and exciting to talk about every single day if you're just going off where the body of evidence is going. So I respect that we need science communication and the hierarchy of evidence needs to be respected on social media, but then we also risk trivializing sports science and the hierarchy of evidence the way we've got the emergence of these evidence-based influencers that have this weird business obligation to have something new to talk about all the time. There needs to be more honesty about that on both sides. Again, a lot of the critics of the evidence-based era are starting to point this out, and again, people like Menno, people like Mike Israetel have been criticized about this. Like, they've all made some pretty clickbaity extrapolations and some reaches based on the research. I mean, I like Mike Israetel, and I feel like he's a little bit more honest with his science communication than Menno, but that's just my bias and my perspective. I think Mike's a funnier guy than Menno as well. That might be shaping my opinion there. I don't think I understand Menno's sense of humour. We're not going to get into, did Menno and Brett, was them funding the squats versus hip thrust study a good idea? We can talk about squats versus hip thrust studies though, because this is the other thing with the evidence-based era. Like, your body of research is only as good as the line of inquiry, which comes from your philosophy. All of these questions that are being asked in the research, like, should I do squats or should I do hip thrusts? That is a stupid thing to study at a population level. Like, that was a much better, you know how you work out whether you do squats or hip thrusts? It's like, what equipment do you have access to? What exercise do you like the most? Are you trying to grow your quads at the same time? Or are you just trying to focus on the glutes? You can't just do a study at a population level and be like, ooh, squats are the best glute exercise. Hip thrusts are the best glute exercise. Because it's just, I don't know, it's just ignoring a lot of pragmatism there. And again, when you have a look at the way that study was designed and how many products that Brett Contreras sells around hip thrusts, it just, the whole funding and setup of that study demonstrated a huge lack of self-awareness from both of them. And I don't think it was a service to the evidence-based community. Or just in general, hey, let's not do another squats versus hip thrust study. It's a dumb question. You know how you work out whether you should be doing squats or hip thrusts? Chat to your client about their preferences, what they have access to, and what their goals are. Then you get a pretty fucking clear answer on whether you should be doing squats or hip thrusts. As Milo said when he came on the podcast, a better observation to try and attempt to make would have been, do the glutes respond to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, using the hip thrust as the shortened bias and then the squat as the lengthened bias. Even though it's still weird, it would have been so much better to contrast like an RDL and a hip thrust, in my opinion. Anyway, like I said, so yeah, a lot of the biggest studies that get the most eyeballs on them from these evidence-based influencers are some of the dumbest studies. So it's like, one of them, it's so hard to get people. I'm going to do a set, then we're going to talk about how evidence-based has become just something you put in your Instagram profile rather than a sign that you're actually reading any research. I would argue 99.9% of people with evidence-based in their Instagram bio have never fully read a single study past the introduction. I made two bigger jumps and I still have talking points, but we'll soldier on. And so the evidence-based era isn't going anywhere, and social media is only going to be a bigger and bigger influence on the fitness industry. So it's hard to know what to do about this going forward. We just need, at the end of the day, more responsible communication about these topics. Because I think it is a mistake to reject sports science as an emerging thing that can really contribute to your understanding of training and your training practices. But I don't like the identity of being evidence-based. I just think it's problematic, and I think it's particularly problematic being an evidence-based influencer. I don't know. And don't get me wrong, I'm sympathetic to the evidence-based influencers. Like, you know, it's so tempting when a new study that contrasts against the current body of evidence emerges to be like, everything has changed, when it really hasn't. Like, how you need to talk about it is like, okay, so another grain of sand has piled onto this side of the scales. Because that's sort of what we're looking at. We're just looking at a set of scales, and then the studies sort of build up on either side. And you're just meant to typically lean towards where most of the evidence is leaning, unless your personal context is dramatically different or highly specific, and it seems very different to the conditions where all the research subjects were observed under. Okay, so what's the difference between being evidence-based in a cringe way and evidence-based is viewing it as equal parts art and science. What do I mean by this? So rather than looking at the role of an individual study or even an entire body of evidence to tell you exactly what to do as far as your own training protocol or your client's training protocol, how I frame things is the body of evidence will give you your bandwidth of good enough. And then the art is in working collaboratively with your clients to meet them where they're at within that bandwidth of protocols that are scientifically observed and to be valid. So, and case in point, that study on squats versus hip thrusts, it didn't do a good job of telling us what one was superior based on your context. What I gained from all the squats versus hip thrust studies is both of them will grow your glutes. You just got to find the one that your clients likes more, or the one they have a better setup for, the one that they're more excited and willing to work harder at, and that's what's ultimately going to yield the greatest gains. And that's, like I said, that's that art. Some people wouldn't view that as artistic, but I look at it, again, all the fields that inspire me in the way I practice fitness are equal parts art and science. objective and subjective, and people in those fields have a respect for it. These are things like cooking, right? We know objectively to a certain degree what good and bad food is, but then as far as like what's your favorite dish or what's your favorite way to prepare a chicken soup, there's a lot of subjectivity in that. You can't make someone chicken soup and be like, this is the best chicken soup you've ever had. What you can say is like, based on what we understand about food science, I know this is good enough chicken soup, but then maybe you need to season it or adjust it to their taste. And the way I look at training, it's the exact same. Music is the exact same. It's equal parts art and science, like so much mathematics underpinning a lot of the principles that help us make consonant, nice sounding music. So there's a little bit of objectivity to it from that mathematical side. But at the end of the day, it's not most mathematically sound songs that get played on the radio or that you're pumping on your Spotify playlist all the time. It's just the ones that are objectively within the realm of acceptable or good enough music, but then just subjectively you like certain things about it. And people just can't accept that fitness is the same as that. And if you're paying close attention to the evidence on a meta level, this is sort of what's emerging, that your subjective worldview actually has huge implications on your reality, your results and things like. And the frameworks that are emerging that are helping us reconcile this field as an art and a science simultaneously, it's the whole biopsychosocial thing. It's this whole, John Kiley talks about the concept of allostasis a lot. We don't have enough time to break down the biopsychosocial model or what allostasis means. So maybe we'll get into that on the next Max Out video. So hit this for a double and then land the plane and be like, where do we go from here? So how should you treat the hierarchy of evidence, and how much respect should you have for sports science as a coach or just someone who trains hard and wants results? Always keep one eye on the body of evidence, because that gives you your bandwidth of good enough, but you can't expect sports science alone to help you find the optimal training decision. How you find the optimal training decision or intervention is by respecting your own individual context and respecting that this is a little bit subjective and it is a little bit artistic. And when you can respect that duality, it's just the ultimate framework for navigating this era of fitness. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time.